And our opening words this morning are by Paul Bicknell. There are some heights to which we have not risen and never will. There are some depths to which we have not fallen and pray we won't. Somewhere between there are places where we can reach up and reach out for the strength that we need for the journey. This is such a place. We pause in this place for refreshment. We worship in this place in thanksgiving. Dear God, dear center of our being, remind us that you live through people. Your wondrous works appear not by magic, but in the love and concern we can offer to others by what we say and what we do. Remind us also that you live through people we do not like, as well as through people we do like. That you live through people whose skin is a different color, the same as through people who look like us. That you live through poor people, as well as rich people. That you live through people who live in other countries, as well as through people who live here. That you live through people who are different from us, as well as through people that are our mirror image. Most of all, remind us that the more clearly we see and appreciate you in other people, the more clearly we can see and appreciate you in ourselves. A prayer by Steve Dick. Amen. In the Green Mountains of southern Vermont, where I spent last week enjoying the fresh air, the world seemed like a quiet and peaceful place. I enjoyed some time with my family, swam in crystal clear lakes, walked by a house where Norman Rockwell once lived, and tried to tune out the alarming news that streamed into my phone on the rare occasions when the signal was strong enough to pick it up. Alas, it didn't really work. With heavily armed goons blowing civilian airliners out of the air in Ukraine, fanatical Islamists killing their co-religionists by the score in Iraq and Syria, and a democratically elected government in Israel bombing children in response to rocket attacks from other fanatical Islamists. With all this happening, it wasn't Rockwell's uplifting scenes of small-town life that came to mind. On the way back down to the city, we stopped off at the vacation rental of a friend who was engaged in evasive action. No internet, no newspapers, and no television. She explained, taking a news out. The alarming developments in Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, and Israel-Palestine each stand on their own. But there is also a commonality to them that goes beyond the fact that they are so depressing. In a world that has never felt so interconnected, the specter of disorder, destabilization, and brutalism is once again upon us. The Middle East is in chaos. Europe seems to be heading for a mini Cold War. Tensions are rising in Asia. With a feeling of hopelessness spreading, many Americans are adopting the traditional response to chaos overseas: tune it out and leave them to it. But our shrunken world needs the United States, however tattered its image, to stand up for the values and norms it claims to represent. News outs are refreshing, but they don't change the news. Some of you might have been expecting a male Ugandan minister in the pulpit this morning. So let me clear up any confusion on that front early on. I am not Reverend Mark Kiimba. Reverend Kiyimba, who was scheduled to be our guest this morning, was called back to his Unitarian Universalist congregation in Kampala, Uganda, to help with a crisis there. Reverend Kiyimba is ministering to congregants who have been beaten and arrested for being gay. His GLBT activism is just part of his important ministry in Uganda. His congregation also runs a housing program for orphans of AIDS victims, HIV-positive youth, and homeless LGBT youth. While he is where he needs to be this morning, I look forward to having Reverend Kiyimba in the pulpit here another time, when we can learn more about and lend our support to his ministry. You may have been following the news in Uganda this week as it relates to gay rights. Reverend Kiyimba's congregation is celebrating a small victory this month as a law was struck down which had supported life sentences for any promotion of homosexuality, which endangered not only GLBT people in Uganda, but also all supporters of gay rights there. The law was struck down on a technicality, and it is still very dangerous to be gay or a supporter of gay rights, but it is a victory of sorts, and so we celebrate it with them. Knowing that my colleague who would have been a guest here this morning is in the thick of this has got me paying closer attention to the news coming out of Uganda this month. The young Ukrainian man working at my partner Lisa's cafe this summer has me paying closer attention to events there as well. He is not looking forward to returning home in September. He is scared of being drafted into the army. I had been paying attention to the world news anyway, but sometimes when we feel a closer connection to world events, they seem even more real to us. I'll speak more about navigating that sense of connection and interconnectedness later. But as a first step in that direction, I want to acknowledge that in this era of globalization, 24/7 media coverage, and with a growing list of crises to monitor around the world, sometimes when I watch the news, listen to the radio, or read a newspaper, I just want to go back to bed and pull the covers over my head. This week alone, I've listened as the death tolls rise in Gaza. I'm worried about the spread of Ebola in Africa. I continue to worry about the missing schoolgirls from Nigeria. This is day 117 of them being missing, by the way. I've returned to worrying about Iraq, which feels familiar. But now there are those stranded Yazidi refugees at the top of a mountain, surrounded by ISIS, desperate for help from the outside world, and they haunt my thinking as I go through the day. Here in the United States, I'm worried about immigration, particularly about 60,000 children, some as young as 3 years old, who have come to the United States in recent weeks after fleeing extreme violence and conflict in their home countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, only to find themselves in freezing cold detention centers along our borders. Right here on the Cape, I listened to the fearful and closed-minded response of the citizens of Bourne as they reacted to Governor Patrick's invitation to temporarily house refugee children, currently being held in inhumane conditions by our government. I worry about the Pilgrim nuclear power plant in my hometown of Plymouth, and am glad each time concerns are raised in the news because we need to be thinking about it, but it's also overwhelming. I have also been quietly mourning the loss of one of my students at the UU Urban Ministry in Roxbury. A young man who should be enjoying his last few years of high school and dreaming about college, but instead was shot and killed at a party this summer. As far as we can tell, an innocent bystander of someone else's escalating dispute. And I despair, as I know many of you do. I get overwhelmed. I feel helpless. In my despair and distress, one of Wordsworth's poems comes to mind. He wrote, "The world is too much with us." He was talking about materialism, and of course a poet from the 1800s couldn't possibly have known the feeling of a barrage of 24/7 news coverage in a world made infinitely smaller through globalization and social media. But I find his words to be a perfect expression of how I feel sometimes when I tune in to what's going on with world events, or even just my friends and neighbors. The world is too much with us. When the world is too much with us, some of us meet it head on and redouble our engagement. But many of us are tempted to take the covers over the head approach, or other more subtle forms of isolation and disengagement. I resonate with and understand that response. I try it occasionally. But I do not believe that it is the faithful response. Immersing ourselves in the bad news can be overwhelming, triggering, and paralyzing. A day-long or week-long hiatus from the news may be appropriate and necessary. Taking care of ourselves and knowing our limits is imperative. But long-term disengagement is not the faithful response. What do I mean by a faithful response? I mean taking a deep look at our theology and using that to inform what we believe will actually make the world better, what we believe will actually change the news. Now, because our theologies differ, our faithful responses will differ. At times they may seem discordant, at times they will overlap. The theists among us may turn to a practice of prayer to a God who may intercede to bring peace and relieve suffering. The Buddhists among us may increase the practice of meditation, spreading loving kindness and compassion outward in concentric circles to change the energy with both personal connections and those with seemingly more degrees of separation, hopefully until they do not feel so separate. Muslims may turn to the third pillar of Islam, charity, or giving to the disadvantaged. Humanists may bypass prayer and turn to more secular forms of engagement with the world, with petitions, demonstrations, and community organizing, fueled by the sense that it is we who must change the order of things. Faith-based groups of all stripes may also organize to gain traction around education, actions, and legislative changes that will support peace, end violence, and alleviate poverty, motivated by a sense of the urgent need to build the beloved community. I opened with that New Yorker article not really to comment on the United States' engagement in the world theater, but to help us reflect on our own personal engagement practices when faced with the same world events, as well as our innermost circles of concern about ourselves, our families, and our immediate communities. It's not easy to wrestle with. Most of the time it feels like enough, or even more than enough, to care for our closest connections. There is enough need just within the innermost circle of those we know personally, without extending that care to those we don't know. I don't have all the answers or a way to make it easier to be a citizen of the world, but I'll share with you how I wrestle with the job as a spiritual humanist, a pantheist if you want to get technical. A pantheist is someone who sees the universe as God. I remember the sense of relief I felt when I finally discovered the word pantheism. I read about it in the second year of seminary in my Theology 2 class in a chapter called Is God in Charge? Pantheism. Finally, one of those fancy words from the textbook actually applied to my own conception of God. It sounded a lot more profound than web, which was where my secret theological musings had ended up by then. But web still works for me. I see God as a web. I see the universe as God. God is the web of interconnectedness of which we are a part. Nature, which is where I have always felt most spiritual, is worthy of the highest reverence. Humanity is also part of that divinity and must be cared for. I hope I haven't lost you. Bear with me with the theological reflection. This God web is not just a universe of scientific systems. I see it as truly holy. And I believe there is an energy created by that web that is more than the sum of its parts. It's like when people hold hands, and the connection of their hands creates a warmth which spreads through all of them. I believe that spirit can be present with us or absent from us as we are conscious or unconscious of our place in the web. Because I see God as a web, I see revelation as the moments when the intersections of the web are revealed to us, when we feel most part of the web. Revelation is our eyes opening to this interconnection. It feels almost like a literal tug on your heart. So it is this sense of the web that I turn to when I ask myself to think about what a faithful response to world news might be. It's easy, or at least possible, to see God's revelation of this web in moments of beauty, the sunset, the aria, the hug. What I struggle with is recognizing as revelation those moments of intersection that are not beautiful, feeling moved by the news, witnessing and grieving death, witnessing suffering. But if the news is hard to watch, it is the sense of connection to the web that causes that tug on our hearts too. So if revelation equals those moments of knowing we are part of the God web, then the hurting moments are revelation also. When my heart breaks as I listen to a news story, I remind myself that this is me caring for the world. This is God caring for God's self. This heartbreak is holy work. Edward Frost wrote a poem that speaks deeply to my understanding of the world. We have heard that God is all the goodness and the sweetness and the light and joy in the morning. But God is the cries we do not hear, the depth of hell the other suffers, the darkness and confusion of the permanent night. God may be the chaos, missed in our neatness and order, who shuns the glistening temple to walk in the gray repositories of twisted and divided souls. God is the one who cries, "Know me," through the mouths of those we choose not to know. We have heard that God is love, but God is the demand to love, a demand unheeded, thus a God undiscovered. Press through the grown-over path to another's aloneness, and there, with him, the pain and the bearer of pain is God. Maybe you won't recognize me as a spiritual humanist because I am comfortable using the word God, but my theological reflection tells me that our role is not to worship the at times destructive, at times healing force, which we may call God, but rather that our role is to help those who are suffering, because we are the hands of God. We have heard that God is love, but God is the demand to love. Reverend Kathleen McTeague, director of the UU College of Social Justice, was arrested last week at the White House during a protest by faith leaders concerned with deportations and immigration injustice. She was released some hours later. At the interfaith prayer service that preceded this civil disobedience, Reverend Kathleen said to the crowd, "We're gathered together here as people of faith as well as conviction. We come from many different faiths, so I won't presume to know all the reasons so many of you have gathered, but I can tell you why the Unitarian Universalists are here. We're among those who find our home on the religious spectrum at the place that is most thoroughly grounded in this world, in this one precious and fleeting life. That's why we are here as Unitarian Universalists. We see the hell of hopelessness that's been created for immigrants who are lost in detention, the hell of anguish when family members are torn away from each other, the hell of fear when people are so scared of deportation that they can't call the police when they need them. We see the suffering and the deaths caused by turning our borders into military zones, and we see the desperation that drives tens of thousands of children to flee their homes with nothing but a sliver of hope that they might find safety here. Religion at its core, she says, is not about our beliefs. Real religion is about what we do with our beliefs. Our faith calls us to act in every way we can to ease the suffering of migrants and to demand justice in our immigration laws. So today we call upon President Obama, our elected leader, to lead us now in the right direction and to join us in standing on the side of love. I wish I was there. No, I'm not telling you all to go out and get arrested. That is one faithful response, but it's not the only one. So what is our faithful response? Well, if God is the universe, then we are part of God. If we are part of God, then how we act reflects the nature of God. Violence and destruction are part of the universe. People hurt and kill and deport when they feel disconnected from one another, disconnected from the God web. But when people feel connected, they reach out, they heal, they protest, they donate, they volunteer. And that, too, says something about the nature of the world, of the universe, of God. So that's what I think the faithful response is when we are overwhelmed by the not-so-good news. Anything that makes us feel connected rather than disconnected. Anything that adds light to the world rather than darkness. Maybe that faithful response will be directly related to the world event, the personal event that feels overwhelming to you. If you are unhappy with the plight of refugee children, maybe you will attend a protest or vigil calling on our community to house them, as we did last week in Orleans. Or maybe you will sign up for a Just Journey border trip through the UU Service Committee to learn more and see for yourself what the conditions at the border are. Or join the Racial Justice Project here that is working to ensure that Provincetown doesn't take advantage of its immigrant workers. But maybe your faithful response will be different. Motivated by that sense of connection to others that the news reminds you of. Perhaps you will reach out to a neighbor who is grieving. Perhaps you will put $1 in the bucket of a street musician in front of town hall. Perhaps you will volunteer at the soup kitchen in November. Whatever honors connection rather than ignoring it, whatever adds light, that is the faithful response. Maybe it's with your checkbook. Your checkbook is full of light. The insert in your order of service this morning gives you some suggestions of places to make donations when you are feeling overwhelmed and want to help rather than hide. You have your own charities and organizations that you see spreading light. Give to them. Volunteer with them. Throw your stubborn ounce of light onto the scale on the side of peace, hope, healing, and love. It won't necessarily outweigh the darkness of the large-scale events that we are seeing in the news, but it does say and prove and act out something about the nature of the world, of humanity, of God. And when you need to be restored for this heartbreaking work of being of the world, go to the other places that make God's connection come alive for you: the ocean, the forest, the mountain. Listen to the music and nuzzle your head into the arms of a loved one. Hold a baby. Seek the beauty of silence. Bury your toes into the sand, into the earth. Feel that connection. Let it remind you of the divinity of the universe. Let those things remind you of why we bother to care about this God web at all. And here's one last piece of advice. Not a faithful response to darkness exactly, but it's some good advice given to me by a minister. Because we will never know how much our efforts, great or small, change the world, it's good to have a hobby. Something you can put your hand and mind to when you are overwhelmed by the world. Preferably something measurable, something you can begin and end definitively. I recommend cross-stitch. It won't heal the world, but it's satisfying and it doesn't hurt. The Talmud says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Walk humbly now. Do justly now. Love mercy now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." Let's not pull the covers over our heads just yet. Let's nurture our small light and shine it into the world. Ours are the hands of God, and there is so much left to be done. Amen, and blessed be.